What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This is episode 7, the first review of February, and this month we are going to be doing reviews of all of The Lord of the Rings. As you can see by my nifty little cover, the whole big thick edition of the book sitting right beside me. Let's just set that down there to look nice in all these videos. This week, we obviously have to start with Fellowship of the Ring. So, as we all know, this book is legendary, this series is legendary, it needs no formal introduction, so I'm not really going to give a whole lot. Written by J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings is probably the most iconic book of all time, barring only the Bible. The real question that I was asking myself before I started reading this again in November was, is it really that good? Like, is it really? Everybody loves it. It has a lot of hype behind it. The movies are great. But are the books really that good? Well, the short answer is yes, it is. The long answer? Well, let's get into that. Let's begin with my history with reading Fellowship of the Ring. I believe the first time that I tried reading this, I was in junior high school, or I don't think it was in 6th grade, because that was when I read The Hobbit. But it was shortly after I read The Hobbit, somewhere in those couple years. I never actually finished it that first time. I did try reading it again in my freshman year of high school, and I plowed right through it. I don't necessarily remember, particularly loving the book when I read it again in my freshman year, but I did read it very fast nonetheless. It went by a lot quicker than I thought it would. Cut to November 2021, and me reading it for the second time all the way through, trying it for the third time, with real true intent. And similar to my experience with it in my freshman year, it did go by again very quickly. But this time, I very much enjoyed it. I really, really loved reading Fellowship, far more than I expected to. So let's kind of find out why, and start with, what are some of the best elements of Fellowship of the Ring? Well, outside of the prologue, which we'll get into a little bit later, it has one of the most enchanting magical openings I've ever read. I'm not super well versed in the fantasy genre yet. I haven't read a whole lot, and most of my reading experience in general is in YA, but the first couple chapters of this book really do shine for me as a reader. And part of the reason that it shines so much for me is because this book doesn't just drop everything on you in 2.5 seconds like some massive fantasy stories do. When there are that's not the right word. When there are exposition dumps in Fellowship of the Ring, they're done through dialogue primarily, which is incredibly difficult to dislike, especially with the characters that give it. There's one particular character that gives a lot of exposition in 2 particular chapters in this book, and it's done super well. I don't find myself hating it. Oftentimes when you have a lot of world building and a lot of history and a lot of just this explanation stuff in fantasy books, it can feel overbearing, long, and boring. It never feels that way in Fellowship. The characters that Tolkien develops in this book they're not the deepest. They're not the deepest characters, but they are surprisingly diverse, and they're very well differentiated. All of them are super lovable, but they're all very distinct. When any one of them is talking, or when you're seeing through the eyes of any particular one, you know who you're looking the eyes through because of the way that the world around them is described. At one point in this particular book, I'm thinking it was in the first few chapters of the book. I think it was in chapters 3 of book 1 or something like that. I may be misremembering, but Tolkien actually had 1 or 2 sentences of viewpoint from a fox, for crying out loud, which is very charming, but I just wanted to point that out. The characters overall are very great. You get to know them well, and they're built up in a way that they're not confusing. Several characters and several names and several locations in Middle-earth will sound really familiar to one another, and they can sometimes get confusing, but all of the names and locations that are important to this particular narrative are very well established and are specifically pointed out to be important. You never get confused which one you're looking at. The tone of Fellowship of the Ring is extremely positive. It's not afraid to get uncomfortable or tense or even dark in a couple of locations, but its ability to remain positive and hopeful throughout the entire narrative is very astounding. It is a bit different from The Hobbit in this regard, where The Hobbit had distinct tonal decisions and goals that each chapter was trying to make, where each chapter almost felt like its own tonal style and stylistic choices made throughout them. Fellowship of the Ring flows a lot more, and it flows a lot better in that regard. But that's not to say that Tolkien does a bad job in either one. They're each trying to achieve different stuff. But Fellowship of the Ring, while being a lot more adult in style, is still very charming and positive in most regards. I mentioned this in the Hobbit review as well, that the prose was just super good. It's really enjoyable to read Fellowship of the Ring. Back in junior high school, however, I will say that I thought the book was boring. Like I said, I didn't even finish it the first time. But I think the main reason for that was because most of my reading experience was with very YA stuff that got straight to the point and didn't spend too much time doing other stuff. I just think at the time that I first tried reading this, when I thought it was boring, I just wasn't ready or able to appreciate the actual writing itself as much as I do now, because this writing is just fantastic. Now, Brandon Sanderson, as a very prolific fantasy author, has said multiple times in different talks and lectures that he's done about promises and payoff and how a story is meant to do those things to satisfy an audience. Fellowship of the Ring delivers perfectly in this regard. There are many goals built up regularly throughout Book 1, because Fellowship of the Ring is made up of Books 1 and 2 of Lord of the Rings. A little confusing, but not too bad once you get used to it. But every one of the promises that are made in these mini goals are addressed in a satisfying manner. All of these mini goals are set up so that you have a different location that the characters are trying to get to at any one point in time or in any chapter or something like that. And it really does a very good job at separating the narrative into those distinct sections while keeping it smooth so that you know exactly where you're going. It doesn't feel drawn out because you know exactly what you're trying to get to. And even come Book 2, when the scope of these promises versus the payoff is drastically expanded, because in Book 1, the big overarching goal is just to get to one particular location in the world. Book 2, that whole entire arc of what is trying to be accomplished is very much expanded and takes the rest of the 5 books to truly tell in the way that they're meant to be told. But even despite this, Book 2 still does a great job at keeping up with these mini goals and situations that just lets you spend time with the characters and get to know the world and understand the purpose of what is trying to be accomplished, the very importance of the whole narrative. I mentioned this a little bit earlier about characters being well differentiated. There are several great character introductions throughout this entire book, because most of the important characters that you meet in this book specifically, at least in terms of characters aiding the Fellowship. One person in particular is Strider, who, and that's all I'll say, is the name Strider. There are not going to be spoilers in this review, which I suppose I should have said early on. There are going to be no spoilers in any of these 3 reviews, but I will mention the name Strider. Strider in particular in Fellowship of the Ring is a very good character introduction, and also the way you come to know some of the other members of the Fellowship later in the book, particularly Book 2 at the start of that. Everything does very well. All in all, the truth is that there's just a ton to love about this book. There's not a whole lot to dislike, but I will talk about those in just a little bit. One final thing I do want to point out is that the ends of both books 1 and 2 are absolutely perfectly placed. Like, if there's one thing about all 3 of these volumes of Lord of the Rings that J.R.R. Tolkien does very well, is the pacing and where he chooses to separate the books. There are 3 volumes, but there are 2 books in each one, making up 6 books in the entire narrative. The end of each of the 6 books is placed perfectly, and Tolkien obviously spent a lot of time worrying about how these breaks would occur and why they would happen the way they did. In particular, the end of Book 2, which cuts directly into Book 3 very well, is one that is very standout, and we will get into that a little bit in the next video, because Book 3 is the start of the Two Towers. More on that next week. So now that we've talked about some of the best elements of Fellowship of the Ring, what are some of the worst elements? Now, there are several people who are like, well, The Lord of the Rings is perfect, nothing should be changed. But the truth is that there are some things that aren't going to work for everybody, regardless of if anybody, me included, sees any of these books as perfect or 10 out of 10 or with no flaws. There are some things that just aren't going to work for everybody. Now, for me, the biggest sticking point for the enjoyment of this book is the prologue. Now, it is my understanding that it was written after the fact, so it wasn't meant to be at the very start of the book or anything like that. Like, Tolkien wrote it after the fact to put there, but the truth is that the prologue feels very pointless. Like, it just provides additional information about a lot of different things that don't mean anything to the reader beforehand, and it just gives us ahead of time, and it's unneeded. That's kind of what the appendices are for at the end of The Return of the King, with all the additional world building and stuff like that. In my mass market paperback copy of Fellowship, there are 17 pages in the prologue, and literally only 3.5 of these pages matter at all to the narrative of the story. And if you've read The Hobbit, 0 of those pages are important. So if it's been a long time since you've read The Hobbit, or if you haven't read The Hobbit at all, you can read, let's see if I wrote down the section, I believe I did. It's section 4 of the prologue, of the finding of the ring. That's the only section that is important. So like I said, if you haven't read The Hobbit, or if it's been a long time and you don't really feel like reading The Hobbit before reading Lord of the Rings, even though I recommend reading The Hobbit first, obviously, you can read that section and be fine, or if you just want to read it anyway, you're fine. But the rest of the prologue is completely unnecessary and is super long and drawn out and boring. Like, it is legitimately boring. I did not enjoy the prologue. To clarify, the prologue isn't inherently bad, it just feels pointless where it is, especially for people who haven't read the books. If you've read the books before, or even the appendices or something like that, and just want the information, or if you're just going back for a reread of all of the Lord of the Rings, the prologue is fine, and in fact could probably give you some additional details that you just kind of want to know about the world, because Tolkien's world is one of the most standout pieces of Lord of the Rings. But if you're just reading Lord of the Rings for the first time, I would highly advise against reading the prologue at all, because you do not need it if you have read The Hobbit. Now, I did mention earlier as well that the prose is super good in this book, but like I said, when I was trying to read it in junior high, it can take some getting used to. It can feel a little bit boring, or the styles of it, especially in the 2020s, can feel a little bit weird because these books were published nearly 70 years ago. So there's a lot of stylistic choices that Tolkien makes that aren't going to fit naturally for the way that some people read. To a certain extent, I think you do need to be at a certain age to be able to appreciate the prose properly as a reader. Some people, that can be as early as 6th grade, I know, who read Lord of the Rings for the first time. For some people like me, it takes a little bit. I didn't really appreciate the prose until I just read it this last time, and I'm 20 years old now. But to addendum this point, I will also add that the writing does feel surprisingly modern. These books were published 70 years ago, and even The Hobbit was published 80 years ago or something like that. I'm not going to do the exact math off the top of my head, but these aren't new stories, but they do read surprisingly similar to the way that old-fashioned news stories would be written, if that makes any sense at all. I don't know if it does, but the point that I'm making is that some people may initially struggle with the writing of these books a little bit, but giving it enough time, I'm sure that everybody can appreciate it, or at the very least, tolerate it. One thing that Fellowship of the Ring utilizes, but all of the Lord of the Rings utilizes, but starts in this book, obviously, is Tolkien incorporates a lot of songs and poems into the narrative. Some of these can feel super disconnected and pointless. I liked them overall, but they can indeed be a little bit hard to get into for some. And especially, I don't do audiobooks personally, but I know a lot of people who, depending on the audiobook narration that you get, the songs can sometimes be insufferable to get through. If that's a thing for you, I I can definitely say that you can skip all of the songs, because I don't think any of them are like so important to the narrative that you're going to miss something if you skip them. But just give them a chance, because I mean, they read faster than the rest of the book does to a certain extent, and there's plenty of world building and other little hints and stuff that are dropped into certain poems that are really fun to learn about, even if you don't enjoy the poems themselves. But either way, that's something that some people aren't going to enjoy a whole lot. I did mention earlier as well that this book doesn't really use exposition dumps, but the one major exception of this is Chapter 2 of Book 2, which is the Council of Elrond, and to a slightly lesser extent, The Shadow of the Past, which is Chapter 2 of Book 1. They can be a little bit tough to get through because of the exposition. Like I said, they're done through dialogue, so I really like them, especially the character that does most of that dialogue. But it is important to note that these two chapters are pretty long and just dump a lot onto the reader. Most of The Lord of the Rings as a whole, including the next 2 volumes of the story, do a very good job, or at least a good enough job, of separating the way that it dumps all of its world building and stuff so that you don't really notice that it's all happening. But these 2 chapters are important to note otherwise in Fellowship of the Ring. I enjoyed them. I do have a little bit of issue with the Council of Elrond just because it's like 40 pages in this mass market paperback copy, and since each average page has something like 400 or 425 words per page, that's a lot of words in one chapter. It took me like 2 hours to read the Council of Elrond, and that just feels unnecessary. Especially since plenty of the world building and stuff that is done in the Council of Elrond specifically isn't like vital to know, but it's definitely interesting to know. If you can push through it, you'll be fine through the rest of The Lord of the Rings for certain. And now we get into probably the most important thing to note in this worst elements of Fellowship of the Ring. Outside of the prologue, which can just be skipped entirely and isn't really that important, one element that is in primarily Chapter 7, but even Chapters 7 or Chapters 6 and 8 to a slightly lesser extent of Book 1, there is one particular character that is very famous or infamous depending on how you see it amongst the community, and that is Tom Bombadil. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but this is the only super major complaint that I can see. I personally love him. Like, I love Tom Bombadil's character and what he does in the narrative. Those who love him, but those who don't love him generally tend to kind of hate read these sections with Tom Bombadil, if not just DNFing the entire Lord of the Rings here. I don't remember exactly what it was that made me stop reading Fellowship of the Ring in junior high when I first tried it, but I would not be surprised at all if it was the Tom Bombadil sections where I DNF'd, because I don't think I made it to Book 2 when I tried to read it that first time. Like I said, I really enjoyed Tom Bombadil myself, but he is very divisive for good reason. I can completely understand how some wouldn't love him, especially since it's just a million songs in this section. I know somebody who has read the entire Lord of the Rings like every year for several years, for like a decade or longer, and Tom didn't click for that reader until just a couple years ago or something like that, maybe even more recently. Like Tom doesn't click for everybody who reads Fellowship of the Ring, but when he does click, he really clicks and you really start to appreciate him. I know that Tom Bombadil, or I've heard rumor that Tom Bombadil was one of the things that was possibly going to get Lord of the Rings not published, but J.R.R. Tolkien had a very particular interest in making sure that Tom Bombadil was in the story. Like, he thought that Tom was very important for Tolkien, is what I've heard. If you're a reader and you don't like Tom, try to just push through these chapters, because after you've pushed through them, everything else is perfection. So don't be scared away from Fellowship just because of this character, Tom Bombadil. So let's finally get into some of my final thoughts and observations about Fellowship of the Ring. Kind of like what I said in the intro to this video, this is one of the most magical books ever. Like, I get that there are tons of fantasy books that are extremely derivative of Fellowship, but I don't know how I could personally complain about it, given that Fellowship is so magical. But of course, not everybody's going to be able to accomplish what Fellowship did, even if they're copying the actual steps of the narrative. Either way, the prose is a lot of what makes that so good, but regardless, Fellowship of the Ring is so good, and I love it a lot. For these specific reviews, I'm going to say my favorite chapters of Book 1 in Fellowship of the Ring are easily chapters 9 through 12, so the very end of them. It's not necessarily slow going. The first few chapters are very magical, but those Tom Bombadil chapters in the middle can be very mixed for some people, if not outright bad. Chapters 9 through 12 of book 1 is when the narrative really starts to pick up, and then chapter 2 is when that continues, or book 2, sorry, is when that continues. Everything about those 3 chapters is great. My favorite chapters in book 2 are probably chapters 4, 5, and 10. I'm not going to go into why I love those 3 chapters, because that's when you kind of get into a lot of spoilery type of stuff, but they are very good. If you have not experienced Lord of the Rings, please do. And if you can't stand Tom Bombadil, again, I'm just going to stress this one more time. Please just push through, because even if he doesn't click, the rest of it is worth it. And now we come to the conclusion of this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, all that YouTube stuff. If you want one website to go to that has all of my video content as well as all my writing content that I do besides, all in one place, easy to access, go to seasonalproductions.com and bookmark that and check that out. It would really mean a lot to me. This is the end of my review for Fellowship of the Ring. Come back next week where I will be covering The Two Towers. I cannot wait to continue covering The Lord of the Rings with you guys, so stick around for that. I'll see you all in the next video.